All right. Good morning, everyone, from Bowen Island, British Columbia, which is where I am under lockdown. My name is Janice Sarah. I'm with UBC Peter Allard School of Law. And on behalf of the Canada Climate Law Initiative, welcome. We have almost 300 participants today, including from sectors banking, transportation, mining, and energy, as well as a number of institutional investors, regulators, and capital markets participants from across Canada and a few other jurisdictions. Just by way of introduction, the Canada Climate Law Initiative is a collaboration of the law schools at York University and the University of British Columbia, conducting research and knowledge mobilization on effective governance of climate-related financial risk. And CCLI is funded very generously by the McConnell Foundation, Ivy Foundation, the North Family Foundation, and the Jaroslawski Foundation, for which we're very appreciative. Among our initiatives is the Canadian Climate Governance Experts, which is a group of 55 exceptional and notable individuals across the country who are donating their time for free. Business, law, capital markets participants, and institutional investors who are giving their time to meet with boards to give them some advice on how to become effective in managing climate-related risk and opportunities. One quick administrative matter, if you have a question to pose for either Brian or Sean, please do so in the Q&A box. If we can't get to your question, we will do our best to give you a written answer after the webinar. So on that note, let me say that we're delighted to host this webinar because sustainable economic recovery, I think, is top of mind during this period. And green and transition taxonomies offer one important tool that can assure the integrity of financial products and hopefully then accelerate our transition to a net zero carbon economy. We need to align, though, with global standards if we are to continue to attract capital to Canada, quite frankly. And so today offers us an opportunity to hear from two experts about best policies, practices, and standards as we start to develop our own taxonomy for Canada. So with that, I'm going to introduce Brian Minns, who is Vice President of Sustainable Investing for Addenda Capital, and he is a member of the Canadian Standards Association's Transition and Sustainable Finance Committee. And then our keynote, Sean Kidney, who is co-founder and CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, which has been globally recognized, as well as a member of the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. So with that, I say welcome to both of you, and I turn it over to you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Janice. So, and thanks a lot for hosting this webinar today. I think the work that the Canadian Climate Law Initiative is undertaking is incredibly important to the dialogue in Canada and the work that's being done around transition by companies, investors, and other stakeholders throughout the country. So just before I turn it over to Sean, I just thought I'd start with a couple of quick comments in terms of what's going on in Canada right now with the Transition and Sustainable Finance Technical Committee. So just by way of a little background, so last year, 2018, actually, and into 2019, there was a Canadian expert panel on sustainable finance, which put together a series of recommendations across a number of different facets of sustainable finance. One of the things that they focused in on was a taxonomy, or the idea that, that we need to transition from where we are today to a resilient net zero emissions society by around 2050 in order to deal with or mitigate and avoid some of the worst possible effects of climate change. But they also recognize that in Canada, we do have this somewhat or quite resource intensive economy, and we also have a resource intensive society. It's a big country, it's cold, and so on. So we have a number of different challenges. So one of the key recommendations was around clarifying what transition was and how investors, the power of investors, private investors, can be harnessed to help us through this transition. And so a number of stakeholders, so quite particularly the banks, but also pension funds, insurance companies, help put together this technical committee working with the Canadian Standards Association with a few different areas of focus or things that they're trying to achieve. In particular, first and foremost, trying to put together a definition of what transition is and what it means in Canada and for Canadian investors and Canadian companies and other stakeholders. And then to go from the high level down to a sector specific point of view in terms of what does it mean for individual sectors within the Canadian economy. But there's no point in us doing this by ourselves and just in Canada for a made in Canada solution, but there's also a role recognized that we can play in terms of helping catalyze this idea of taxonomy, of transition globally. So that's another mandate or key objective of this technical committee. And then the third piece of the puzzle is there's global work being done around sustainable finance at the Standards Association level, and Canada had not yet been participating in that global work. So this is another avenue to get Canada tied into that global work that is being done. In terms of what's been going on, so the committee has met a few times and a lot of work has been going on. So there's the overall technical committee, and then underneath that, there are subcommittees struck to look at individual sectors of the economy and what transition looks like for those individual sectors. And so there's a draft framework for the taxonomy of transition. And then underneath that, so far, 3 sectors have been developed. And those are going to be discussed by the technical committee at meetings later this month. So they'll be thinking about the overall framework and principles of transition, as well as specific sectors of the economy and what transition-like activities look like for those sectors. And that technical committee, as I mentioned, has the investors, banks, and insurance companies, but it also has some academics, some government departments, and companies are involved as well. So coming out of that, there'll be a document which will then become a public document open for consultation and comment from the public as well, sometime in July, I expect. So that's just a bit of a background of sort of what's been going on in Canada. I think it's very different than what has happened in Europe or is happening in other parts of the world. So we're very, very pleased and lucky to have Sean with us here today to help provide some of that insight in terms of what's going on with green finance around the world, what's going on with taxonomies, what sort of debates are happening around the world with regards to transition. And then we'll seek to sort of piece those two puzzle pieces together in terms of what's going on in Canada, what's going on around the world, and really sort of help us bring a focus on what's important here in Canada. So with that, Sean, I will turn it over to you for some comments, and then we'll come back with some questions and answers, and I may jump in at a few points in time with some questions as you move through some slides.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you very much for that introduction. We will explore what's happening around the world at a particular moment when we put the map up, and let's remind me to run you through a few other countries, because there are taxonomy development projects in multiple places now around the world. But look, just first, the background to this. The taxonomy has arisen out of the green bonds market. The green bonds market has grown like this over the last few years, and Canada has been a player in that, as you all know. I won't go into the detail of what I'm Canada. Suffice to say that this is, or at least until February, was the fastest growing asset class on the planet. It's been superseded by pandemic bonds or COVID bonds coming from nowhere, of course, that have seen nowhere near this level of issuance. But there's been a lot of them from a standing start. That's what I mean by fastest growing. Of course, the COVID bond is in itself a building on the green bond idea. We've seen quite a lot of other thematic bonds issued, from a green bond component in 2013, which is only $14 billion US globally. We've seen a rapid growth, and then we've seen social bonds, sustainability bonds, green loans coming through. A sustainability bond was essentially when someone didn't have enough assets to do a green bond, so they included some public housing as a social asset. Bingo, a new grouping was invented. And that's worked quite well in terms of the kinds of investments that investors are interested in making. This market started as a transparency and reporting kind of market with some claims around environmental benefit. And over time, more rigor and structure has come to it. If I just take you back to the previous slide for a minute, you will see that all sorts of folks have been able to issue green bonds and climate bonds, sovereigns, development banks, asset-backed issuance, and so on. And just to say the reasons why people do it, because this is relevant to the whole thematic market. So far, from an issuer perspective, it's about getting more investors. Because on the investor side, over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a growing appreciation of the risks of climate change and environmental degradation, including loss of biodiversity. And there's been an attempt to say, well, what can we do about this? It's quite challenging when you're an investor, Brian is, for example, to try and figure out how to address long-term risks like climate change with portfolio management strategies that tend to have a shorter-term horizon because the methodology is available to us and so on. So what do you do in those situations? For insurance companies that started this process on the liability side, they started changing their insurance policies. We've seen insurance companies, for example, reinsurance companies largely withdraw from the coastal market in Florida because they see the risk of increased hurricane strength thanks to climate change as being too great and not enough mitigation of that risk happening in that area. On the investment side, post-2008, we saw the growth of this particular market, which is a simple idea. Rather than try and bring in climate risk into the coupon of the bond or the risk of the bond, which is a longer term objective, but very challenging to do with the lack of tools, we've simply said the proceeds are going to be used to address investments that are material to addressing climate change. But the bond will be fully backed by the issuer. That's what the idea was. It started off actually with the European Investment Bank and then the World Bank wanting to reach out to investors with a particular interest in environmental issues in Scandinavia and California and places like that. The World Bank wasn't known as a particularly green institution in 2008 when this started. The Scandinavian investors who were approached by the World Bank said, look, carve us out a portfolio and, by the way, get an independent review because, you know, your president of the time is not the greenest president of the world. That was Robert Zoellick, you may recollect. And that led to this idea of getting an independent review of the green credentials, which has underpinned the growth of this market, but a very important aspect of increasing confidence by investors of the proceeds are going to the right kind of place. So this is a standard corporate who issues a bond. It's a bit like, I describe it in some of my talks as if you want to borrow money for a car from your cousin. You go to your cousin, and you say, I'll promise to pay you back. The cousin says, she says, sure. But you know what? I don't think it's a good idea investing in petrol cars. I think we need to go to electric vehicles. So when you buy an electric and you say, okay, I promise to use the money only to buy electric, but I'm still backing it personally. That's what a corporate bond is or a green bond is essentially. Same principle. And that simple idea that it's a bonus feature of a bond that has similar risk yield characteristics to all other bonds, a bonus feature of the proceeds are being used for investments material to addressing climate change has been the driver of this market, the simple idea. For investors, there's a risk mitigation aspect to it that drives their thinking. This has got to such a stage that in Europe, when a corporate issuer issues a green bond, their stock price goes up and stays up. In a sense, investors are using the issuance of a green bond in the absence of lots of other metrics available as a signal that that issuer is doing something to keep ahead of the risks that investors feel are coming down on climate change, but they're very hard to actually pick the details of those risks. So the client demand is very strong. As a result of that, we've seen the characteristics of green bond in the secondary market in hard currencies become a kind of capital protection characteristics. That is, in downturns, they tend to hold their value, which is pretty cool. Now, Brian will know more than anything is that when there's a downturn, well, if you're on the fixed income side, your main job is not to lose your money. And if something looks like it's going to be better at not losing your money, it suddenly becomes very attractive. And now we have a bit of a cycle in liquid currencies, in US dollars, and we think it's beginning to appear in renminbi now. We've seen some very interesting movements recently, and also in euros, of course. But the market is essentially globally a quarter USD, a quarter euro, and a quarter renminbi. So China is a big market, and the rest scattered around different currencies. As the CAD market grows, well, based on the other markets, we can expect it to start experiencing some of these characteristics in terms of secondary market value, but we'll see. So issuers are not issuing to get a discount price. And even in markets where they are getting a lower coupon because of the secondary market value, such as in Europe, they tell us that's not the reason they do it. In a survey we've just done of 86 issuers around the world, they're saying it's the investor engagement that drives them. They want to become closer to the investors, and you see that reflected in investors responding to the stock price bounce. Basically, they want to get to know Brian Wins better. That's what it boils down to. And of course, we see investors regularly coming out and saying, we really like the green characteristics, tell us more. When a new issuer comes to market, I remember KfW, the German development bank, when they did this, they thought they had every investor in the world already on their books. And when they issued their green bond, it took them 2 years to decide. It was a tortuous process. They thought they'd give it a try to try and support the German green bond market. They got people phoning up they never heard of, wanting to invest in their bond. And most interestingly for them, a lot of their main existing clients phoned up and said, we love your bond. Can you tell us more? And they said, but you know about us. No, we want to know about the green bond and the green investments. And it was like, well, they called it stickiness, but let's just say investor engagement. So these are the background to this market. The market, because it's adopted a slightly different approach to ESG, that is, the risk aspect is done the traditional way with whatever risk tools you've got available to you. Now, you might just use an S&P rating or a DB rating, or you might have a whole ESG filter over it, which is fantastic if you do. That's how you deal with the risk. And then as a bonus feature, at whatever risk level you're looking at, you've got the option of choosing something that allocates proceeds to addressing climate change, which means you've got junk green bonds, AAA green bonds, and so on. This is quite different to what other markets have done. This idea has led itself to the framework of focusing on specific investments that address climate change, as distinct from, say, percentage decarbonisation pathways or slightly more amorphous ideas. And that's meant, in the end, a taxonomy. So over the last few years, we've developed a taxonomy of the climate bond standard as a voluntary measure to support a certification scheme. And we've seen the reporting and transparency measures that have evolved, codified in the green bond principles, and now the social bond principles and sustainable bond principles as the offshoots of that market. But a few years ago, government started thinking, whoa, this is a really cool idea to try and promote investments in public policy priority areas addressing climate change. How can I support this? Well, the Chinese were the first to start. They introduced regulation around green bonds, the beginning of 2015, to govern it. Essentially, if it was going to happen in China, they wanted to make sure it happened right. And we weren't going to have too many slightly dubious green bonds from provinces in Western China. So they brought in a tough regulation, and they copied the climate bonds taxonomy and instituted a catalogue, a taxonomy of green projects in China, which has governed the market since then and allowed it to grow to now being actually the world's largest green bond market by a whisker. That was the first. Then we've seen green bond regulation or formal Securities Commission guidelines issued in multiple countries, notably in Asia, around ASEAN, in India, but also in, would you believe, Morocco and Nigeria, where the governments issued a couple of green bonds. And in China, they went further and they brought in incentives. Now, when you get incentives, the potential for scams becomes a bit more pertinent, so that the self-correcting market measures are not seen by governments as being solid enough because there's some form of government support on the line. And in China, there's a lot of government support on the line. If you're a bank and you post green bonds as collateral at the liquidity lending window of the central bank, you get a 1% discount on wholesale funds, which is pretty cool. Bank of Canada, come on. But anyway, we'll leave that for the moment. Europe is considering the same. So Europe, arising out of the high-level expert group on sustainable finance, which I had the privilege to be a member of, which I think inspired the expert panel in Canada. We looked at incentives and we suggested a taxonomy for Europe. The Commission said yes. And now that they've brought in a regulation around a European taxonomy, which links up with a regulation on climate risk and sustainable investments disclosure, a common framework for sustainability and climate risk disclosure across all investors, corporates, and banks in Europe is coming in. The taxonomy is the lexicon, the common language, if you like. It's also going to be used by the Green Bond Standard and used for member state reporting and so on. So this is something in progress, and there are incentives as part of all this mix being discussed. Since then, there's been other green bond regulations and guidance in other markets, as you see on the map, and I'll come back to the taxonomy in a minute. So incentives and the prospect of them have led to governments picking up the taxonomy idea to make it very clear. This is not the case in Canada at this stage. I want to be clear. This is the global shift. But through that, we've seen a popularization of taxonomy as an idea. And now multiple other countries are thinking about doing a taxonomy. We have a taxonomy project underway in Colombia. In Japan, the Ministry of Environment has put out green bonds guidelines with 10 pages of guidance on clear investments, broadly in line with the EU taxonomy. We're about to start a project in South Africa for South African taxonomy, again, broadly in line with the EU taxonomy with special features for the local economy. Bank Negara in Malaysia has done something, New Zealand's looking at it, and there's a discussion underway in Mexico. We'll see where it goes. And of course, most relevantly here, the Canadian Standards Association now has this taxonomy group, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Over time, we're keen on looking at harmonization, Brian. Sorry, Brian, my apologies, go ahead.
Well, you were just about to jump into where I think I wanted to ask my question. So lots of different taxonomies and activity going on in the world. You specifically highlight EU-China harmonization, but that was going to be my question is, so many different taxonomies and approaches. How is this all going to end? How are we all going to come together?
So they're not that far apart. And the Chinese taxonomy that we've, supported over the years has got a lot of great stuff in it. It is a pollution-focused taxonomy, more so than climate-focused taxonomy. Because, as you know, China's got a pretty bad air, soil, and water pollution problem, and that's what they're focused on. There are climate features. Last Friday, the People's Bank of China, the central bank, published a new taxonomy, or at least an updated version of it, which has been endorsed by all the, or rather jointly issued by all the regulators. Before China, there were some differences between different regulators, complicated, 7 different regulators, very messy. So now they've sorted out the internal differences, they put a new taxonomy, and they've done something which makes harmonization a lot easier. They've removed coal. So because of air pollution reasons in China, ultra supercritical coal, very important to say ultra, not just supercritical, which removes the NOx and SOx out of pollution from coal, is fantastic for air pollution in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. It basically fixes it, but it still allows carbon emissions, about 40% less than another coal plant, but not quite good enough in current thinking about transition, if you like, to a low carbon economy. So now they've taken that out entirely. They've removed a few other things, and they've put a few new things in too, like sustainable agriculture, geothermal, and so on. So in a sense, they've done a lot of things to make it much easier to harmonize with Europe. We expect the formal discussion on harmonization between Europe and China taxonomy to begin as soon as basically flights begin again. And we'll see where that goes. Now, it's not going to be a perfect match, but the truth is the differences aren't great. We're actually in the middle of a study comparing the new taxonomy from China with the European one and looking at recommendations for work on the middle. And each one has stuff to learn from the other one. I personally think Europe should adopt big chunks of the Chinese taxonomy around pollution and land remediation. Equally, there are many areas in the European taxonomy that are not currently covered in the Chinese taxonomy, and that'll be the flavor of discussion. Of course, if Europe and China get together, chances are everyone will follow. The discussion we're having in these other areas is mainly about alignment with the European taxonomy, because Europe tends to be one of the large centers of global capital. So in Japan, this is definitely the case, and in Colombia and South Africa, this is the case. I think that's been part of the brief for the Canadian Standards Authority to look for alignment with the European taxonomy and do extra work in areas that are particularly pertinent to the Canadian economy. So we'll come back to the Canadian taxonomy in a minute. And of course, Brian, you're in the middle of that discussion. Did I get that right?
Yep.
So that's the background. So let me just give you a bit of a flavor of the European taxonomy, and then I want to cut to the Canadian taxonomy. So this is a bigger thing than a regulation for a green bond market, but the idea has come out. The idea of absolute measures is the key feature of a taxonomy, as distinct from relative measures. You know, when the Dow Jones Sustainability Index started, you had the best performing coal companies in there. In any class, it was the best performing approach. And you still see this with some models like GRESB or property, which has been served us well to get to where we are. But of course, with climate, it's a little bit different because there are some things which are just straight out. So according to the International Panel of Climate Change 2018 1.5 degree report, and also the IPCC modeling of a Paris Agreement, sorry, I should say the IEA, International Energy Agency, that came out at the end of that year. The emission reductions that we have to achieve to avoid catastrophic climate change are very severe. And that's because in the last 30 years, we've put in more emissions in the atmosphere than the previous 150 years. We've sort of failed, unfortunately. So some things that we thought were going to happen or could work, they've said don't work anymore. The specific thing that Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, said was that there can be no new unabated fossil fuel investments in the energy sector, electricity sector in particular, if we're to meet the Paris Agreement. That was deeply challenging. You know, I heard a presentation from the Minister of Environment of Israel at a roundtable in the Madrid Climate Change Conference in December. And they were very proudly saying they're abandoning their coal-fired power station. They're building a whole lot of gas plants because Israel's got a big gas find offshore. And that's their climate change plan. Bad news, guys. That looked like it in 2017. But in 2018, we had to redo the modeling and redo the science, and we realized, our window's closed. It just went like that. Our ability to build new gases transition has unfortunately gone, except in exceptional circumstances. And by that I mean carbon capture and sequestration, which is not fully viable yet, but I'm hopeful that some of the new options for carbon capture and sequestration coming through will become financially viable where there's a modest carbon price. Probably not going to happen, there's no carbon price. So these are challenging findings, which are related to a global transition pathway that we have to achieve, 50% reduction in emissions. These become absolute measures, or at least the basis of absolute measures. An absolute is, I know you can have a best-in-class gas company, but no new gas can work here. And that becomes terrifying for some of us, but essential to understand what a taxonomy can do here. So it's not best of class. And this also comes down to the nature of ambition in sectors like the building sector. So the IEA again tells us that we have to achieve drastic changes in the built environment. By some 40% of the emission reductions out to 2050 have to come from the built environment, buildings. We have to improve energy efficiency to be able to shut down fossil fuel energy faster. That's what it basically boils down to. I mean, if we shift to clean energy, like Iceland, then we're going to be okay. We don't need to worry too much about it, but that's not really happening anywhere around the world. Does it make sense, Brian?
Absolutely, it makes sense. And I just want to think as like these scientific realities and this view of the world in terms of what the Paris Agreement says, what you're seeing from these synthesis reports on climate change and so on, things like you're saying about gas, like just want to be clear, what role did that body of knowledge play as the group was putting together the taxonomy in Europe?
So these were our reference reports. So our ambition, we were tasked with an ambition to address climate change, mitigation and adaptation, by the way, and then also move on to look at other components of addressing environmental challenges in society, which I'm going to argue are related. Circular economy, for example, we will look at next year. Now, circular economy is resource efficient and should reduce inputs from all sorts of sectors, like from the fossil fuel sector and so on. Pollution control, hence my comments about the Chinese taxonomy, but also relevant to making sure our ecosystems are healthier. So the other one was healthy ecosystems and healthy environments, especially natural capital. We have seen an extraordinary degradation of our natural environments around the world, with China and India and now doing what we did in Europe in the 40s and 50s, and then started improving on, which we've got to address. And in fact, it's worth noting that the IPCC Health Committee for the past 20 or 30 years has been predicting that climate change won't necessarily be felt by a slightly increasing sea level rise on the waterfront at Montreal. It's going to be felt by a series of shocks. For example, environmental degradation is linked to pathogens jumping between species and pandemics. This is actually what we think now happened in the Middle Ages and in the 1600s, when we saw the spread of plagues as a result of climate shifts. Long story about why those climate shifts, but They were related to man-made, especially in the 1600s, when essentially the number of people we killed off in the Americas, 95% of the native population, thanks to introducing smallpox and measles to a population that had no defense against it, meant that we saw massive forestry growth in tropical zones in particular. And we now know from looking at tree rings that the amount of carbon sucked out of the atmosphere was extraordinary. It cooled the planet. It cooled the planet by 2 degrees in the 1600s. And we felt that not as cooling, we felt that as failure of crops for a couple of years, compounded by volcanic explosions, by the way. We had 3 big volcanic explosions then. Long winters, famine, drought, floods, especially in Japan, for example, the floods were incredible in that period of time. War. We saw massive war in Europe and China and places like that as a result of these changes, and pestilence. We lost a third of the world's population in the 1600s, a third of the world's population, scattered around, or in every continent, apart from Antarctica. This is extraordinary. And when we experience really severe climate change, that's how we'll experience it. We will experience it as pandemics. This pandemic is a result of pathogens jumping between species from an ecologically stressed environment in southern China, as the Middle East virus a couple of years ago came from ecologically stressed colonies of bats in Egypt. We now know this is a regular feature of climate change. We have been told by IPCC to expect a series of pandemics this century as a result. The one we're in is our test run. Luckily, the mortality rate is relatively low. Unfortunately, it targets my age group, so I'm hiding indoors at the moment. But, it is only likely to be 1% by the way they finish, which is still huge globally. SARS, if that had been the pandemic, that's a 20% mortality rate. The Black Death was a 30 to 40% mortality rate. So, guys, we've got to get ready. This means the agenda, from our perspective, the EU taxonomy, is even more pertinent than it was now. We focused on mitigation, and we looked at how we would interpret the IPCC report and the IEA report. Europe's targets were not aligned with our thinking when we started. They caught up last December when Europe adopted a 2050 net zero target and is now adopting a 2030 50% cut target in line with our thinking. And we looked at adaptation and resilience. Now, we've established some principles for resilience. We focused on adaptation around the mitigation activities and a few extras. We had a technical expert group meeting this morning, and we're saying we now need to stretch that discussion into different forms of resilience, because the learning from this crisis is that resilience isn't just about coastal protection. Resilience has got to be about your health system. Can we deal with these shocks when they hit us? It has to be about our social protection systems. Can we actually feed people in a crisis like this? Make sure they get food, get enough income to eat, and so on. If only because we don't want the pandemic to continue to spread in vulnerable populations, which will eventually get the rest of us. So you can't hide if you're rich in these kind of circumstances. This is a significant rethinking we need to do about what we understand about climate resilience.
So just to tie back to the expert panel, or sorry, the taxonomy work. I think last week we saw Europe, or the Commission, sort of push through what they're seeing as their pandemic recovery plan. We see the European Green Deal being prominently featured in that. I think, as you talked about, there's a number of health resilience sort of measures in there, quite some significant expenditures, I think, in that area. And then also, a lot of it focused on the Green New Deal. So, are they using the taxonomy? Are those things linked enough at this point?
Yes.
Or
yes. Okay. the news from the Commission last Thursday was that taxonomy is going to guide the green recovery and the stimulus. Now, the actual application of taxonomy to job creating schemes in Eastern Europe, it requires a bit of work in terms of, energy efficiency, solar rollout, and so on. But that's the principle. And they've adopted something else too. In the taxonomy, we talked about substantial contribution to climate issues and the various environmental issues, but we also talked about do no significant harm. And the simplest way to explain it is you can't build a solar farm in a wetland. That's it's common sense, but we're trying to spell out a few of these things. Now, they've picked up the do no significant harm measures that we've introduced in taxonomy, like if you're building infrastructure, you've got to address adaptation issues, and said that's going to be a filter for looking at the recovery fund that they've introduced, which is 540 billion euros in stimulus. So yes, they're using it.
That is fantastic news. And my follow-on question then on that do no significant harm piece was that something that emerged out of the technical group, or came down from above in terms of the mandate given to the group?
Well, we were given the 6 objectives, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, if you've got the screen available, including pollution prevention. And we basically said up front, well, look, there's no point in doing climate mitigation activities if you're also destroying biodiversity, right? Now, Brian, you and I would know that's common sense, but these things have to be spelled out sometimes. In the do no significant harm provisions in the taxonomy, about 3/4 are covered by European regulation. So we spelt them out for international audiences to see the sort of things we think are important going forward. Some things are not yet covered in regulation. You know, if you're doing a major building development, you need to be thinking about flood risk in there. And if the planning laws aren't in place to protect you, it doesn't mean you can avoid thinking about them, because it's still a real material risk. And that's the sort of thing we're trying to tease out in that area. So yes, it is a new one. We've put in a couple of safeguards too, just labour rights and human rights, ILO convention and so on, minimal safeguards.
And what, like, I think there's different things going on. You talk about different parts of the world doing different things. So we have this European approach, which is kind of top-down mandate from the Commission, you know, figure this out, get on with it, you know, develop a set of taxonomy and a variety of other things, as opposed to some other markets, Canada being one of them, where we don't have that top-down sort of direction. I'm trying to pick up on this do no significant harm piece and the minimum safeguards. Like, what role do you think those additional pieces play in terms of the global appeal of the taxonomy that Europe's put together, in terms of giving investors and other participants assurance in it?
Well, to a certain degree, you as an investor representative can answer that question. I mean, how much do you worry about side effects of doing something when you're making an investment? I'm going to say, I know from you worry about it, but the toolkit to be able to assess is challenging in this area. So what we're trying to do is to spell out, to make it easier for people, the kinds of things that minimally you need to address, to make it easier for everyone to understand. Now, I'm going to say that the application, there'll be differences of views at different national levels. And one of the challenges for harmonization will be in Colombia, they might have a view on the do no significant harm measures, which is different to Europe in some areas. At some point, there's going to be negotiation. This is going to end up like the World Trade Organization, in my view, the way it goes forward. But the direction of travel is what is important here. And that part of it, I think, is well established. I mean, there are a few other things that are important, and this takes us to the Canadian taxonomy. We've established stuff that's, let's say, green, solar. We've talked about enabling emissions, manufacturing. We've had a long conversation about manufacturing of components. You know, if you're a lithium battery manufacturer for cars, we think you're in. If you're a lithium miner, it's a bit more complicated because the lithium could be used for other things. And so, you know, if you're purpose-built mine only for electric vehicles, okay. But if it's built for other things, we need to have a closer look at it. So there's the sort of discussion we've had in manufacturing. And then this idea of transition, which is there's a whole bunch of things that we haven't really taken seriously in terms of the sustainable and green markets that we have to. Metals manufacturing is a big one. You know, we need steel. We're going to need a lot of steel to build a low carbon economy, particularly in emerging markets. But we need to make sure it's zero carbon steel. How do we get there? So in the European taxonomy, we've put in an interim threshold for emissions from steel to try and push the industry in that direction, and we'll tighten that over time. In fact, I actually think we're going to be able to get the net zero carbon steel by 2035, is my personal opinion, based on the technology movements we're beginning to see. And a lot of it's to do with green hydrogen. So we've also talked about hydrogen. And there are 3 kinds of hydrogen: black from coal, if you like, blue from gas with carbon capture and sequestration, and then green generated from wind farms or hydro. And that's the area we have to focus on. We're going to need a massive amount of hydrogen. In fact, I think Quebec Hydro ought to be really thinking about green hydrogen generation as another business line when they've got capacity at night, for example. And I'm saying this to Saudi as well, as an alternative economic development Saudi for strategy, is to build big solar farms, generate hydrogen, and sell it to Japan and China. And I actually think this is going to happen. These are transition issues. There's a lot of things to tease out here. We're only at the beginning of the road. And of course, you're looking at this, I know. Of course, I want to mention adaptation and resilience, but I've already covered it going forward. One little tweaky, by the way, we've allowed consultancy services in this area. Everyone should be getting an adaptation and resilience report if they're building infrastructure or mines. We've got to grow an industry. So I want to mention that it links to the Sustainable Development Goals, because we see that as a clue to the kinds of resilience measures that lead to broader social and economic resilience. So fleshing those out to be more of a taxonomy is one of the jobs going on. In fact, tomorrow morning, I'm joining a webinar in China where the UNDP China is launching a draft SDG taxonomy as a starting point for this. That work's underway. But I wanted to take you into some specifics briefly, in case anyone's got any questions. These are the sorts of things that are in the European taxonomy. I'll just give you a couple of highlights. In buildings, where we see this as a transition sector, we have to drive the transition. We're saying, as a principle for existing buildings, the top 15% of buildings in any country or province will qualify. We've got to assess how to do that, and there's a whole lot of metrics available. We can talk about that. It's a simple principle. That will get turned into absolute measures, that is emissions or energy efficiency, within 5 years for every geography, and every geography has to do that. So we're giving the time to get the metrics and data in place, and then that keeps getting tougher and tougher. By 2050, net zero, everything's net zero, which means 15% of the buildings in Vancouver would be eligible for green bonds in the European market under this model. That's the idea behind it. In electricity, it's a pretty tough threshold of 100 grams of CO2. As I said, the International Energy Agency suggested, and we've enshrined here, fossil fuels without carbon capture and sequestration simply can't be included, can't be done. If you do carbon capture and sequestration, yes, you need to also measure emissions across the life cycle. There's been some very bad news in the last 7 years, massive spikes of methane into the atmosphere. And I don't know if you see much of this in Canada, I don't think so, but the Permian Basin, it leaks like a sieve. And this stuff is 20 to 80 times more potent than CO2. So a lot of the claims we're making about reduced emissions in Germany or the US, they may not be true. All we know is we've got a problem, we've got to fix it. So if you're not measuring, as is increment estimating, you can't even be at the table in Europe, if you like.
So I'm going to jump in here. So that some of these proposed rules are at the crux of, I think, where Canada is coming from and where Canadians are coming from. So I'm going to just, pose a few questions that I've heard as I've been going through these discussions for a while now. But on the electricity side, for example, so these are like green and like pure, very high standards. And I from what you're saying, and I think I understand, like this is in line with going to net zero by, say, 2050.
They're not pure. But sorry, I'll challenge you on that word, but keep going.
Well, a common question or a common thought is, well, that's all well and good but right now we have, let's say we have a certain old gas-fired electricity generation facility, and this gets to the core of the transition discussion. Okay, that exists right now. Let's say it had, very hypothetical, it has 15 years left of life. I could spend a certain amount of money and reduce the emissions by whatever, 20% over those 15 years. Should that qualify for a transition financing? Would that qualify for a green loan? That's a common question that I hear.
So I'm going to say that the main principle we have to follow is that what are we transitioning to? And we need to transition to the Paris Agreement. That's the critical point. Everything flows back from that. That's what we try to do in the EU taxonomy, and that's what our transitions label's about. Now, that needs to understand what the sector-specific transition pathways are or can be, and whether you can even transition a sector. That's the absolute discussion I had earlier. And it's got to be linked to the modeling to get us to 1.5. That's the basic point. Within that, there's a hell of a lot of room for discussion. Our own view, as we've said expressly, which is really the IEA's view, is that there's no room for unabated fossil fuels going forward. That's the key message. So at the electricity generation level, this is particularly important. We don't think there's a room for increasing capacity with fossil fuels. There may be, if you can do it for carbon capture and sequestration, it's still possible, but realistically, the best you're going to do is replace stuff that you're closing down. It doesn't mean the fossil fuel sector is going away in the next 15 years, necessarily. I think coal will, and as you know, we've got an absolute ban on coal in Europe for various reasons, thanks to the European Parliament, but that's a different game. So with gas, where the work has to be done in our view is the existing infrastructure and the existing demand with an eye on not increasing demand and utilisation of gas. That's what I'd say. But there's still stuff to be done. The first thing to be done is we've got to measure. I just say that because that's sort of like, you've got to be at the table, you need to measure. But that can be changed very quickly, especially with satellite monitoring, which is becoming into force. And I'm hoping the Canadian industry will be at the forefront of this going forward. And then we have to look at how we can reduce emissions while we continue to use it. With a caveat is we don't want to create new assets that are stranded, and we don't want to increase usage of fossil fuels going forward. So there's a framework for gas. Now there will be different views in that, and some of it will be tough. And I think in the Canadian context, I've heard conversations, well, we may be able to displace some other gas producers by higher quality. Interesting comments. I'm interested to see where that conversation goes. I don't know. I think my main comment is we need to look at this, which is why I welcome the work of the Canadian Standards Association. On oil, we are not going to get rid of oil in the short term. I do happen to think that out of the transport sector, the use of oil for combustion will disappear unbelievably fast. And it kind of needs to because it's polluting. That is, we'll shift to electric drivetrains in urban areas and hydrogen for long distance. And that has a credited impact on what the oil sands industry looks like going forward. In terms of what can be included, we're going to still need oil, so we need to make sure that the utilisation of oil is in areas that are minimal emissions and that we're improving emissions where we are utilising it. And again, that requires investigation and discussion. I mean, Mike, the CEO of Sunscore, came out with a very interesting think piece a few days ago, where he was arguing that the significant opportunities, especially in the context of the collapse of the oil price now for Suncor. I think the largest tar sands company in Alberta, but anyway, they're large, that they should be looking at the utilisation of bitumen rather than oil going forward, and the business opportunity was large. Now, I got very excited by that because it looks like, needs a bit of investigation, that the emissions pathway for that utilisation that is drastically different to burning oil for cars. And so I'm kind of hoping you guys will look at that in your work and come up with some views about how it aligns with the Paris Agreement clearly, and as part of, teasing out pathways for the sector. I mean, it is 25% of Canada's export income. Canada has to look at this going forward. But we've also got to look at it to have confidence that we're in line of addressing the Paris Agreement, and there lies the fun part.
So picking up on that Suncor article, I think it is quite a fascinating discussion that's going on there. Like these other uses beyond combustion for our oil sands oil. But I guess the question back to sort of the European experience is the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 sort of discussion. So I can do things that reduce or even eliminate. Theoretically, you could use nuclear power, which is a different topic of discussion. You could use renewable power to extract the oil from the oil sands and drastically reduce the emissions at the point of extraction. Then you still have the product, and if you're going to combust it, the emissions are still there. So I guess that's factored into the taxonomy as well. That's
a do no significant harm provision. You can't build a railway line to a coal mine. Doesn't count, because you're carrying coal, which is actually not excluded in other factors, even though it's low carbon. If you're carrying coal on a mixed railway line, this affects Canadian Pacific, of course, then we allow that because the infrastructure is being used and can be used for other stuff, and hopefully will not be used by fossil fuel carriage over time. I mean, this is challenging for India Rail, who makes all its money carrying coal. But at the same time, India Rail needs to expand intra-country transport dramatically. And so we hope that'll be picked up by freight things. So you allow that because it's still low carbon, but dedicated becomes difficult. Now, when it comes down to the usage of the resource in Alberta, if that resource is being used in a way which doesn't qualify, that would make it really difficult to add renewable energy to it. If the resource is being used in a way that does qualify as a transition, this is the bitumen versus combustion discussion, then yes, it becomes a really viable option. There's a lot of fine tuning to be done here, Brian. We're not going to get it perfect, but you get the gist of the argument.
Yeah, for sure.
That's my main point, really. Whatever we do, there isn't really any option but to work to address the Paris Agreement. Because, this is civilization at stake. Frankly, what we're talking about, what climate scientists tell us is if we miss this 50% reduction in 10 years, we get catastrophic climate change. We will definitely see 20 degrees warming Celsius in the Arctic. That might be great for resources extraction, but it'll be really bad for the rest of the planet. Mm-hmm. We will definitely see drastic changes to the weather systems of the planet with heating, heat incidences that are being predicted in places like southern USA called wet bulb temperatures, which is essentially where the relationship between heat and humidity gets to a point where we stop being able to transpire and we die.
Even in the shade, yeah.
We get about 4 hours to live in those circumstances. You saw actually a death like this in Kuwait last summer when they had 60 degrees Celsius days, and which is unheard of for a period of time. And there was an unfortunate Indian worker who died because he was still working outside. Now we're not all going to be able to escape to air conditioning. And so these are extreme things if we don't make this deadline. Look at our deadline, 2030. You will know whether kids have got much of a future in 2030.
So we're going to run out of time soon. So I have a couple of quick questions to get to for sure. So you put up the Canadian Transition Finance Taxonomy. These are the different sectors that are being worked on. I think the question, we've only got a few minutes. So what are some key considerations for people to consider as they're, some of these sectors are still to be developed. There's a technical committee meeting to go over what work has been done and so on. So what are some of the key features that people involved in this work, or indeed will be commenting publicly later on, that they want to ensure are included in this taxonomy and these definitions in order for this to be effective to do this net zero transition?
Mining is a big opportunity. We need to identify minerals that are critical for the transition. It won't be oil and gas critical, frankly. It'll be rare earths, it'll be lithium, it'll be copper, cobalt, and so on. We need some understanding, some rules, and some criteria, including, by the way, the kind of extractive indices, best practices that are common in Canada, clarified so that we can then say that whole mine is part of this and can be included. So rare earths and Nunavut, for example. So I'm really hoping you're going to be able to do some work in that area. We couldn't get to it in the EU taxonomy. It's slated for next year's work. I'm hoping you're doing our work for us there. That's one. In areas like materials, transportation, forestry, and agriculture, we've done quite a lot of work in that area. I'm hoping that we can be broadly aligned in that, or hopefully exactly aligned if we can get there, but there'll be a discussion, no doubt. Aviation we didn't cover, but I can talk about aviation. We have some views. The oil and gas we haven't looked at all in the European taxonomy, so we are expecting you to put out some ideas in that sector. And my hope, I suppose, is that you're listening to the climate science, which I think you are, and being robust in that line, but also being creative, because there's stuff to be done here and we need to figure out what it is. And I have to say, I've been really surprised about some of the ideas that are coming out of this area, and it's making me very, very keen to see more work. And the Suncor one is an example. I don't know whether that stacks up because I haven't done the science, but geez, it was exciting to read the article as a potential way forward in that area.
What about, the particulars here, and this goes right to the heart of the differences between Europe and what's happened there, the top down, and the sort of industry up approach that we're seeing here in Canada. What in particular should a Canadian stakeholder or even a global stakeholder coming in looking at Canada pay attention to in this environment where it's a kind of coming from the bottom up industry stakeholders as opposed to from the government?
Well, remember the taxonomy grew bottom up in the sense that the idea started as a climate bonds volunteer taxonomy that various parties around the world, we've still got about 500 people involved in different expert committees there, as a tool for investors like yourselves at Addenda, for example. And that's how it developed. And I see that what you're doing in Canada is a similar approach. Now, I would like, and I know we've got a couple of Ministry of Finance officials listening into this, that the Canadian government do take a cue from the European Union and look when a taxonomy is there and and it looks like it's in the right place, start using that as a framework, as a common language for supporting the industry in transition and the Canadian economy in transition. Absolutely. But that's where we get to. But in the meantime, I think we get the process going by looking at the science questions in here. And remember, it's not an NGO view, it's not a government view. It has to be a science view that drives this. But the challenge for us is to then turn that into something that's usable for investors and banks, because the science stuff can be very shades of grey. We've got to, and what we did in Europe was come up with binary solutions. We've effectively identified investment grade environmental is the way we describe it.
So I think we're pretty much out of time. So Sean, if you want to wrap up in 1 minute, then I'll turn it back over to Janice to close us out here.
Look, I want to end up on this slide. We're in an unusual time in history. This COVID crisis is, well, as I suggested to you earlier, is a time to learn about the resilient side and understand better how we make our societies better able to respond to the shocks that I'm afraid were guaranteed to be a feature of the 21st century now. And the only question is the severity of the shocks. And it's much bigger than infrastructure resilience. And I think that's a moment of reflection and a moment of learning. But also in coming out of this, we do need to inoculate against catastrophic shocks. That's green stimulus stuff, which the Canadian government is saying the right things about at the moment, which is great. This is where taxonomy discussion starts leading, because to understand what the shopping list is, you've got to do some work to identify the shopping list. Look at the fridge and see what's missing kind of idea, which is what I see you doing in the Canadian Standards Association. That's essentially what this is. And then that makes it easy for everyone to work out where to place their money in a way that is consistent with the challenges we face. That's all this is about. But there's something else about this. You know, I don't think we've ever seen a moment in history where humanity is united with a common enemy like this, thanks to the internet and thanks to a common lockdown. I mean, I have these Zoom meetings in South Korea, in China, in Colombia, all the time. We're all in the same boat. And it's extraordinary. And the air at the same time, everywhere is clean. It's getting a bit dirtier in Beijing now, they're getting going. But in Delhi, it's clean. The animals, you've seen all the photos of animals appearing in the cities as people have stayed home. There's this moment when you can sense the possibilities. We have an air of possibility. And I think we need to hang on to this as our rebuild and recover, and really make this moment in history work so we build a future fit for our children.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sean.
So if I can just jump in here to close out. First of all, I want to thank you both for a highly insightful and concise conversation about a topic that's very much on the mind of capital markets and other participants in Canada. We really, really appreciate this. We hope we can continue to work with the Climate Bonds Initiative and other organizations to get the very best that we can as we chart our green recovery in Canada. So thank you again to Sean and to Brian and to Joanne Forbes, who was our technical expert getting us through this. Just by closing, I want to thank you all for participating. We will make a recording of this session available to you and try to answer the questions we did not get to. I also want to say in closing that our next webinar is June 30th, and we are going to tackle what we call some of the more challenging conversations in governance around a green recovery, including looking at Indigenous green energy policy and finance, and looking at how one develops multi-actor alliances in carbon-intensive industries. So we know there's lots going on about a green recovery. We think we need to have some very serious and candid conversations to really lead us really helpfully. So again, thank you, and have a good day.